For more on this, let's bring in Michael Oren, former Israeli ambassador to the U.S. Ambassador, thank you so much for being here. So there you have it, the latest hostage exchange. 3 Israelis, including an Israeli American, for 369 Palestinian prisoners, including 36 individuals who are serving life sentences for acts of terrorism. One of those individuals, one of those terrorists, killed 12 Israelis, linked to the deaths of 12 Israelis. You've been critical of this ceasefire in that you have voiced your concern that this could, in fact, empower Hamas in some way. What do you make of this latest prisoner exchange and where the negotiations are right now?
Well, it's excruciating, Brian. It's excruciating for Israelis. On one hand, there's the joy of the reunion of these 3 hostages with their families. Interesting, one an American Israeli, another a Russian Israeli, another Argentinian Israeli. Shows the international scope of this. On the other hand, we are releasing these terrorists, 369 terrorists who have blood on their hands. And we know from previous exchanges that about 80% of them go back to committing terror. The former head of Hamas, who was eliminated, Yahya Sinwar, had been released in an earlier exchange. So we know that, and they'll go on to kill more Israelis. And also Hamas. Hamas, if we move into a second phase of the ceasefire, Hamas will basically regain control of the Gaza Strip and prepare the next October 7th, because its leaders say they will keep on mounting attacks against Israel until Israel is destroyed. At the end of the day, Israeli society is a unique society, and this is the price that Israelis are willing to pay to get these hostages home. But we also understand the severity of the price.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, they're at 12 o'clock today, which was the deadline imposed by President Trump for Hamas to release all hostages. President Trump went on Truth Social and said, look, with this exchange of the 3 hostages, I'll leave it up to Benjamin Netanyahu if they're going to end this ceasefire. It appears Netanyahu had a security meeting at noon, and the ceasefire truce continues. What's the calculus right now, you think, when he had that meeting with his security team for Benjamin Netanyahu right now into deciding whether or not to continue with phase 1 of this deal?
That is the big question that everyone's asking tonight, and the answer appears to be this. The Army has been fighting now for close to 500 days. It needs a rest, low on ammunition. Give the Army a chance to catch its breath and build up its arsenal again. But beyond that, if we go back to fighting in Gaza, we have to be able to say to ourselves, honestly, that the 30 remaining hostages who are alive may not be so, because if the Israeli army had proceeded on the assumption once upon a time that if you ratchet up the pressure on Hamas, it releases terrorists, we found out when we ratchet up the pressure, Hamas doesn't release the terrorists, it shoots it shoots the hostages rather. And so it's a terrible decision that the government has to make. And I don't think any Israeli government would be prepared to go out to the population and saying, listen, these reunions that we've seen between these families, those 30 remaining hostages are not going to have those reunions because they're going to be executed by Hamas.
Ambassador Oren, we have a shot up here at Tel Aviv. This is Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who has arrived in Israel tonight, Israeli time there. The goal for the Secretary of the United States here is how to get this ceasefire, we assume, into phase 2 of this truce, which under phase 2 is the release of all the remaining hostages and a complete Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. What do you think needs to happen from the United States perspective to make sure that this does enter phase 2?
Well, in great contrast to the previous administration's policy, Marco Rubio has said that every Palestinian civilian killed in Gaza is killed because of Hamas, not because of Israel. National Security Advisor Mike Waltz said tonight that Hamas must be destroyed. Hamas is not going to be part of the future of Gaza. So I think that the Secretary of State will be discussing with Israeli leaders how, after the second phase, once we get all the hostages back, once Hamas is regaining control in Gaza, how then can we renew the conflict, the struggle against Hamas, and eliminate it entirely? But there's also going to be a bigger picture, Brian. It's what's going to happen in Lebanon, what's going to happen in Syria, whether Syria will remain a threat to Israel, and above all, what's going to happen with Iran and the Iranian nuclear program, as reports have been circulated that the Iranian regime is very close to making a crude nuclear device.
Yeah, no doubt. And, you know, Ambassador, you've spoken about this. The real risk here of empowering Hamas and undermining the Palestinian Authority. When they release these hostages to Israel, they're parading them. Hamas right now is in a position where they are seen perhaps it seems, as the group that is providing aid, allowing for aid to come into Gaza at this moment through these exchanges. What's the risk here that the Palestinian Authority will be further undermined and that Hamas will then be strengthened as this ceasefire continues?
Well, one thing, the Palestinian Authority does much to undermine itself. It hasn't been able to fight off Hamas in parts of the West Bank and the northern part of Samaria and Jenin. It's failed to do so. And the Palestinian Authority has even refrained from condemning the horrors of October 7th. It doesn't distinguish itself much from Hamas. At the end of the day, it's not the Palestinian Authority's authority or stature we have to worry about. It's our security. And our security can only be guaranteed if Hamas is destroyed. And this is what Mike Waltz has said tonight. Hamas must be destroyed. He's absolutely right. But we also have to get the hostages back first.
When Secretary of State Marco Rubio meets here in Israel with his counterparts, I'm wondering, what role does President Trump's latest proposal about displacing 2 million Palestinians out of Gaza, taking control of Gaza, which has been met with just widespread condemnation from the Arab world, what role does that new idea play in the negotiations here and in the continuing, whether or not this ceasefire can continue?
Well, I think it's changed the conversation, Brian. The conversation for the last 30 years, and I've been involved in that peace process for 30 years, has been that the only way you can move forward in the Middle East diplomatically is by creating a Palestinian state. Because without the Palestinian state, so the old school used to say, that's the source of all the instability in the Middle East, because there's no Palestinian state. Along comes President Trump and says, no, the source of instability in the Middle East is the Palestinian penchant for violence. And that Palestinian penchant for violence is a result of socioeconomic conditions in the Gaza Strip. You correct those conditions, and you're going to get a lot less violence. So I think that principle, that notion has changed the dialogue, has changed the discussion about the Middle East and about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, the big question, how can this be implemented? Where would these Palestinians move to? Those are technical issues. But what has been established is a principle. And there's no way back from this. There's a principle that says we have to get to the core of the conflict. The president is saying this is the core, and I think about 80% of Israelis agree with him.
Do you think the Arab world will continue to support this, given the fact that this proposal has been on the table? I know the president met with the Jordanian king, and they spoke about this. The Jordanian king was not a fan of this proposal by Trump. I mean, I got to think, I just want to get your thoughts on the X factor here, which is now President Trump, and how that might be playing a role here moving forward.
Well, I think no one's really disagreeing with the principle that Gaza has to be reconstructed. And having spent a lot of time in Gaza as a soldier, as a civilian, it's beautiful beachfront, everyone's right. And that the potential there is immense. The question is, how do you realize the potential? And what the president is saying, it's very difficult to realize that potential if you have 2.2 million people, refugees living in tents, and they're sitting on top of about 30,000 unexploded bombs. It's very difficult to do. I think people in the Middle East will generally agree that building Gaza and making it into a prosperous, secure zone without Hamas is a very, very good idea. It's actually an essential idea. How do you get to that ideal? That's where the statespeople, the politicians, sit down and knock their heads together and come up with a solution.
And real quick here, do you think that this ceasefire continues into phase 2?
My gut feeling tells me it really has to. Again, Israelis want to see these hostages home. They're not willing to say that the 30 hostages are going to die, that they won't have those reunions with those families. It's just too difficult. We are an unusual society in that way. The Israeli parents send their kids into the army with the understanding with the state that the state will do everything possible to free their children if they're ever taken captive. And that's sort of a basis of the way we defend ourselves from war to war. And we're willing to take immense risks in order to preserve that principle, including the resist of releasing terrorists who most probably will go back to being terrorists in the future. It's a difficult, I understand it's a difficult dynamic to understand. It's peculiar to Israel. We have no choice. At the end of the day, we will continue the struggle against Hamas until Hamas is eliminated.
And here we have Secretary of State Marco Rubio at the tarmac there in Tel Aviv, greeting his counterparts there in Israel. The main goal for Secretary of State for Marco Rubio is what, Ambassador Michael Oren?
Main goal is the next steps in Gaza, pursuing the Israeli-Saudi peace agreement, ensuring that Hezbollah will remain cobbled and cowered in Lebanon, assuring that the Syrian situation, and we don't know who's going to be in control of the situation, will not threaten not Israel, not Jordan, other countries in the Middle East. And ultimately, as I said earlier, the big issue is going to be Iran. And what are we going to do about the Iranian nuclear program?
Well, so we shall see. An important visit by the Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Former Israeli ambassador to the U.S., Michael Oren, thank you so much for being with us through that landing there. I appreciate that. Thank you.